Old poor black woman recognized a diamond bracelet missing for 20 years at a billionaire's gala, and the room went silent. She had not planned to say anything. She stood near the wall, holding a silver tray of champagne glasses, wearing a white uniform that smelled like starch and sacrifice. Her hands were rough, her shoes were borrowed, and the woman standing 10 feet away from her was worth more money than this entire building. But then the light hit the bracelet, and Joyce stopped breathing. Her tray tilted. One glass slid. A young waiter nearby caught it without looking, but Joyce did not notice. She was staring. Her eyes had locked onto the thin line of diamonds wrapped around the wrist of the most powerful woman in the room, and something ancient and furious had woken up inside her chest. Because Joyce had last seen that bracelet 20 years ago, in her own home, on her own wrist. The night everything was taken from her. Now here she was, 61 years old, poor and invisible, standing in the most expensive room she had ever entered, watching a billionaire laugh and sip champagne while wearing the one thing that had connected Joyce to the daughter she lost. She had two choices: stay quiet and go home empty again, or open her mouth and watch the whole room turn against her. She chose fire. Before we go any further, if you are the kind of person who believes that truth always finds its way home, hit that subscribe button right now, like this video, and drop your location in the comments. People all over the world are watching this. Let them know where you are watching from. Now let us go back to where this story really begins. Joyce Dlamini was not always poor. There was a time when she lived in a clean house in Soweto with her husband Sifo and their little girl Nomsa. Sifo worked at a construction firm, and Joyce sold fabric and school uniforms from a small shop she rented near the taxi rank. They were not rich, but they were stable. They were together, and that felt like everything. Nomsa was 7 years old when she disappeared. It was a Tuesday. Joyce remembered because she had just finished pressing Nomsa's school uniform and hung it on the chair beside the door. She walked to the kitchen to pack lunch. When she came back, the chair was empty. The front door was open, and Nomsa was gone. The police came. The neighbors searched. Sifo drove through every street in a 6-kilometer radius, calling Nomsa's name from the window of his old Corolla until his voice cracked. Nothing. Nobody saw anything. Nobody heard anything. The bracelet had been Nomsa's birthday gift. Joyce's mother had given it to Joyce when she turned 16, and Joyce had passed it to Nomsa the morning of her birthday, just 2 weeks before she vanished. It was thin and gold with 7 small diamonds that caught light like little stars. It was the only fine thing Joyce had ever owned. When Nomsa disappeared, the bracelet disappeared with her. Sifo fell apart slowly, and then all at once. He stopped eating, stopped going to work, he started drinking, and one day, he just did not come home, and Joyce never found out what happened to him. The shop closed when she could not pay rent. She moved into a single room in Tembisa. She cleaned houses, she waited tables. She ironed other people's clothes and cooked other people's meals and folded other people's lives into neat little piles. She kept going because stopping felt like forgetting. And she refused to forget Nomsa. 20 years passed, 20 quiet, heavy, grinding years. And then one evening, a woman named Thandi, who cleaned at the same hotel as Joyce, told her about a catering job at a private gala. 500 rand for one night. Joyce said yes before Thandi finished the sentence. The gala was at a glass building in Sandton. Joyce had passed that building 100 times on the bus and never imagined she would be inside it. She ironed her white uniform 3 times. She polished her shoes until they could almost pass for new. She told herself this was just money, just one night. Walk in, serve drinks, walk out. She had no idea what was waiting for her inside. The room was enormous and cold and filled with people wearing clothes that cost more than Joyce's rent for a year. There were flowers on every table that had no smell but looked expensive. There was music that felt shy and careful, not like music made to move you, just music made to fill silence. The guests floated from one end of the room to the other like they owned the air itself. Joyce moved along the edges. She refilled glasses. She smiled when smiled at. She disappeared the way poor people learn to disappear in rooms like this. She was good at it. She had been doing it her whole life. And then she saw the woman. Her name was Refilo Kumalo. Joyce would learn this later. But in that moment, she was just a woman in a black dress that fit like it was designed for her body and her body alone. She had diamonds at her ears and a sleek phone in one hand, and the kind of posture that said she had never waited for anything in her life. She was laughing at something a man beside her said, and her wrist moved through the air, and the chandelier light touched the bracelet and exploded it into 1,000 little points of brightness. Joyce froze. Her tray dipped, the world tilted. Everything inside her went completely, terrifyingly still. She knew that bracelet. She knew the way the clasp sat slightly lower than center. She knew the third diamond from the left was smaller than the rest. She knew because she had stared at it 1,000 times on her mother's wrist before it became hers. She knew it the way you know a scar on your own body, the way you know your child's voice in a crowd. Her heart was hammering so loud, she was sure the people near her could hear it. She did not let herself think about what would happen if she was wrong. She only thought about what would happen if she was right and said nothing. If she walked out of this building again and left that bracelet on another woman's wrist and went back to her single room and her borrowed shoes and her silence, she could not do it again. She had stayed silent for 20 years, and silence had given her nothing. She placed her tray on a side table, straightened her back, and walked toward Refilo Kumalo. If you are still watching, I need you to pause for 1 second and hit that like button. This story is about to break you open. Share it with someone who needs to believe that truth still wins. And drop your country in the comments right now, because this community is watching from everywhere. Now back to the room. Joyce was 3 steps away when a tall man in a suit stepped in front of her. He was clearly security. He looked down at her the way men like him look at women like Joyce. Like she was furniture that had moved to the wrong room. He said, very quietly but very clearly, that the catering staff was not permitted to approach the guests. Joyce looked him in the eye, and she said, equally quietly, that she was not approaching a guest. She was approaching a woman who was wearing her bracelet. The man's face changed. His jaw tightened. He glanced over his shoulder at Refilo and then back at Joyce, and his voice dropped even lower when he said that if she caused a scene, she would be removed and she would never work in this city again. Joyce almost laughed. This city had already taken everything from her. What exactly was she supposed to be afraid of losing? She stepped around him. Refilo Kumalo noticed her when Joyce was still 2 steps away. Her eyes moved over Joyce the same way everyone's eyes had been moving over Joyce all evening. A quick, unseeing glance. The kind of look that turns a person into wallpaper. But Joyce spoke before that look could settle. She said, calmly and clearly, that the bracelet on Refilo's wrist had belonged to her mother. That it had 7 diamonds. That the third one from the left was slightly smaller. That the clasp sat lower than center because her mother's wrist had been small, and the chain had been adjusted once by a jeweler in Jeppa Street who had used a different ring to close it. She said her name was Joyce Lamini, and the last person she had seen wearing that bracelet was her 7-year-old daughter who disappeared 20 years ago. The room had been loud, and then it was not. Conversations dropped away one by one, like lights being switched off. People turned. The music kept playing, but nobody was listening to it anymore. Every face in that enormous room had rotated toward the corner, where a cleaning woman in a borrowed uniform was standing in front of one of Johannesburg's most powerful businesswomen, telling her she was wearing stolen property. Refilo Kumalo did not explode. She did not call security. She did not laugh. She went pale. And that was the thing that told Joyce everything. An innocent person would have been confused. An innocent person would have asked questions. An innocent person would have said, I am sorry. I think there must be some mistake. Where did you say your bracelet was from? Refilo went pale and her eyes moved. Not to Joyce's face. To the side, searching, calculating. Joyce watched her do it and felt something shift in her chest. Not triumph. Not yet. Something older and quieter. The specific feeling of seeing the truth arrive after you have waited for it so long you almost stop believing it would come. The man beside Refilo, the one she had been laughing with, leaned toward her and asked in a low voice what was happening. Refilo said nothing. She was still looking at Joyce, and Joyce was still looking at the bracelet. Then a woman near the back of the room called out and asked if someone should call the police. At that word, Refilo finally moved. She set down her glass. She lifted her chin, and she said, loudly enough for the people closest to hear, that this bracelet had been in her family for 15 years, and this woman was clearly confused, and this was extremely inappropriate behavior from a member of the catering staff. The room breathed out. Some people nodded. Someone near the door started speaking quietly again. and the event manager appeared from nowhere and touched Joyce's elbow and said in a tight voice that they needed to step outside. Joyce did not move. She said she was not leaving without knowing where that bracelet came from. And then she said something that stopped everyone again. She said her daughter's name was Nomsa, and she had written that name on a small strip of paper and folded it 3 times and tucked it inside the clasp of the bracelet the day she gave it to Nomsa. She said that any jeweler or any police officer with a magnifying glass could open that clasp right now in this room in front of everyone, and they would find a folded piece of paper with her daughter's name on it. She said she would wait. Nobody moved for what felt like a very long time. Then a man Joyce had not noticed before spoke up from across the room. He was older, silver-haired, and he had the calm authority of someone who had made enough money that he no longer needed to perform confidence. He said his name was Joyce Mokoena. He said he was an attorney. He said this was a very serious claim, and the simplest thing to do was to check. Refalo's jaw tightened so hard Joyce could see the muscle in her cheek working. Joyce Mokoena produced a small penknife from his pocket and offered it, handle first, to Refalo, and said all she needed to do was open the clasp. The whole room watched. Refalo's hands were shaking. She knew. Joyce could see she knew, but she had come too far, and she was standing in front of too many people, and her pride was the only wall she had left. She opened the clasp herself, and she dropped the bracelet. It landed on the marble floor with a sound so small it should not have been able to silence a room, but it did. Joyce Mokoena picked it up. He moved to the nearest light. He bent close. He used the tip of the penknife to lift the thin strip of paper folded inside the clasp mechanism. He unfolded it. He looked at Joyce, and he read it out loud. Nomsa. The room cracked open. Some people made sounds. Some people said nothing. The event manager had stopped trying to remove Joyce. The security man was standing very still near the wall with his arms at his sides. Refalo Kumalo had taken one step backward, and her face had gone from pale to something that was not a color anymore. Joyce was not crying. She had thought she would cry, but what she felt in that moment was not soft enough for tears. It was something that had been pressed down for 20 years under the weight of too many silent mornings and too many empty rooms and too much grief that she had carried alone and pretended was smaller than it was. Now somebody else was holding it. Now the room was holding it with her. Joyce Mokoena called the police himself from where he stood. He did not step away. He did not whisper. He made the call in the middle of the room while Refalo stood there with nowhere to go and nothing left to say. What came out over the next 3 days shook Johannesburg. Refalo Kumalo had built her first business with money that did not belong to her. 20 years earlier, she had been involved in a child trafficking operation that police had never fully unraveled. Nomsa was not the only child. There were others. The bracelet had been a careless trophy, the kind of mistake that arrogant people make because they stop believing they can be caught. Nomsa had survived. She had grown up in Cape Town under a different name, raised by a woman she called Aunt, never knowing the truth of where she came from. When investigators showed her a photograph of Joyce, she sat very quietly for a long time. Then she said she had always had a dream, a recurring dream about a woman hanging a white uniform on a chair near a door and calling her name for breakfast. She had never known what that dream meant. She was going to find out. The reunion happened in a small room at a police station, and there are no words in any language that can hold what happened inside it. So this story will not try. Some moments are not made for description. They are made for living. What this story will say is this. Joyce Dlamini had spent 20 years being invisible, 20 years of people looking through her, stepping around her, seeing only her uniform and her tray and her borrowed shoes. And in the end, it was exactly that invisibility that brought her into a room she was never supposed to enter. It was exactly her poverty that put her in that uniform. And it was exactly her grief that gave her the courage to speak when every powerful person in that room was waiting for her to stay quiet. She had nothing left to lose. And that is the most dangerous thing a person can be. At the end, when the journalists came and the cameras came and everyone wanted a quote, Joyce gave them only one sentence. She said, "Truth does not expire." And somewhere in Cape Town, a young woman who had spent her whole life not knowing her own name pressed that sentence to her chest like a bracelet, like 7 small diamonds catching light, like a piece of paper folded 3 times with a name on it that had waited 20 years to be read out loud in front of everyone. If this story moved you, do not let it stop here. Subscribe to this channel right now because we tell stories like this every week. Stories about ordinary people who refuse to be silenced. Stories about truth that survived things that should have buried it. Stories that remind you what human beings are actually made of. Hit the like button if you believe that the truth always finds its way home. And in the comments, tell us where in the world you are watching from. There are people watching this in living rooms, in kitchens, in buses, and hospital waiting rooms, in tiny apartments in cities that tried to break them. Let them know they are not alone. Drop your location below and stay until next time, because the next story is already waiting.